Hey, you made a pretty bold accusation a couple minutes ago. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more about that?
What was it? What?
The steroids comment?
Everybody's on steroids.
Boxing has long been plagued by a significant drug problem, and while this isn't exactly breaking news, the extent of the issue is staggering. Many of the fighters who dominate the sport or are competing for world titles have been caught using banned substances over the last decade. The list of offenders seems endless. This isn't a new phenomenon either. It's been happening since the sport's early days. Even iconic names like Muhammad Ali faced accusations, though the context and regulations were vastly different back then. In the past, drug testing in boxing was far less stringent than it is today. Without robust testing measures, one can only speculate about the extent of substance use during those times. However, the situation today is still deeply troubling. With the immense amount of money circulating in the sport, even at the domestic level, some fighters are willing to risk everything for a competitive edge. This is where organizations like VADA, WADA, UCAD, and USADA step in, conducting tests to ensure fairness and safety. Yet, despite their efforts, fighters continue to test positive for banned substances. This raises a critical question. Can this widespread issue ever be resolved? The answer, unfortunately, is both yes and no. Realistically, the problem will never completely go away. There are too many variables at play, from the athletes themselves to the governing bodies and commissions. However, there are measures that could significantly reduce the prevalence of doping, and we'll explore those shortly. One major hurdle is the inconsistency among governing bodies, commissions, and testing agencies. Each operates with its own set of rules and standards, which often leads to confusion and loopholes. For instance, when fighters are caught with banned substances in their systems, the consequences can vary wildly. Some receive lengthy suspensions, while others seemingly escape unscathed. Take Dillian Whyte as an example. He showed an adverse finding just days before his fight against Oscar Rivas, but was still allowed to compete. Similarly, Eric Morales tested positive for clenbuterol ahead of his bout with Danny Garcia. Yet the fight proceeded as planned. Oscar Valdez's case was even more baffling. He tested positive for a banned substance, with both his A and B samples, confirming the result, but his fight against Robson Conceição still went ahead. None of these fighters faced significant repercussions afterward, which sends a troubling message about accountability in the sport. Then there's Tyson Fury. While he has a massive fan base, it's a fact that Fury failed a drug test for nandrolone, a banned steroid, after his fight against Christian Hammer in February 2015. Yet no immediate action was taken. Instead, Fury went on to face Vladimir Klitschko 8 months later in what turned out to be one of the most significant heavyweight fights of the era. The controversy surrounding this case deepened when it took nearly a year after the Hammer fight for the failed test to be made public. By then, the damage had already been done, and questions about transparency and fairness remained unanswered. Klitschko's manager Bernd Bunte expressed his frustration in a revealing interview, stating that had they known about Fury's failed test, they would have insisted on more rigorous testing for their fight. This highlights another glaring issue: the lack of standardized protocols for testing. For a fight of such magnitude, both fighters should have been subjected to stringent testing. Considering the devastating power of heavyweight punches, the idea of
Did I introduce Margaret Goodman and Flip Homansky that run VADA, two people like Dick Pound, who was the founding chairman of WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. Yes, I made some introductions, but nothing more than that.
Enhancing that power with performance-enhancing drugs is mind-boggling. Adding to the confusion is the discrepancy between different testing agencies. UCAD and VADA, for example, have different lists of prohibited substances. This means a fighter could fail a VADA test for a particular substance but pass a UCAD test, even if the substance is still in their system. Why aren't these agencies working off the same list? The lack of uniformity not only complicates the enforcement of rules, but also creates opportunities for fighters to exploit the system. It's clear that the problem isn't just with the athletes. It's deeply rooted in the structure of the sport. Governing bodies and testing agencies need to align their efforts and adopt a unified approach to combat doping effectively. Without this, the current state of chaos will persist, and public trust in the sport will continue to erode. One potential solution to curb doping is the implementation of harsher penalties. Lifetime bans for repeat offenders or those caught using highly dangerous substances could act as a strong deterrent. Additionally, making the testing process more transparent and ensuring that all fighters are tested under the same protocols would go a long way in restoring credibility. However, it's important to acknowledge the economic pressures at play. Boxing is a business, and high-profile fights generate massive revenues for promoters, networks, and sponsors. In some cases, the financial stakes are so high that turning a blind eye to doping becomes a convenient option. This conflict of interest undermines efforts to create a clean and fair sport. Ultimately, while the fight against doping in boxing is far from over, addressing the inconsistencies among testing agencies and enforcing stricter penalties are crucial steps in the right direction. It's a daunting task, but for the integrity of the sport and the safety of its athletes, it's a battle worth fighting. Doping in boxing has become so widespread and the punishment so lenient that it's almost normalized. Consider this. One of the most notorious figures in the history of sports, Victor Conte, is now working with some of the top fighters in the world. If you're unfamiliar with Conte, back in the late 80s and 90s, he developed supplements, some legitimate, others designed to evade detection by drug testing agencies. He amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune by collaborating with elite athletes while meticulously planning their doping cycles to ensure they never got caught. While his actions were reprehensible, his cunning and knowledge made him something of a twisted genius. Conte worked with numerous boxers during his prime, and when his operation was exposed, it sent shockwaves through the sports world. Many of his clients faced scrutiny, including Hall of Famer Shane Mosley, who admitted in court that Conte taught him to inject EPO, a banned performance-enhancing drug. Mosley confessed that he willingly used EPO after meeting Conte in July 2003. Interestingly, this was shortly after Mosley's back-to-back losses to Vernon Forrest. Just 2 months later, he defeated Oscar de la Hoya to become a three-division world champion. The timing was, to say the least, highly suspicious. When justice finally caught up with Conte, he served a mere 4 months in prison. Whether that constitutes justice is debatable. Remarkably, it didn't take long for him to re-enter the sports world. Today, he focuses primarily on boxing, promoting his infamous supplement brand, Snack, and working with top fighters such as Terence Crawford and Devin Haney. This raises a glaring question. How is someone with Conte's history allowed to be involved with athletes, particularly in a sport as dangerous as boxing? Ryan Garcia recently brought this issue to light after his fight with Devin Haney. Following the match, Garcia failed a test for ostarine, a banned substance. He suggested that because Conte works with Haney and allegedly has connections with Invada, the test could have been tampered with or contaminated. While this claim might seem far-fetched, it's worth noting that Conte is reportedly friends with Margaret Goodman, the founder of Veda. To address this, Conte admitted, "Yes, I introduced Margaret Goodman and Flip Homansky, who run Veda, to Dick Pound, the founding chairman of WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. But beyond that, I had no further involvement." While his admission doesn't directly implicate him in tampering, it highlights the concerning overlap between his connections and the sport's regulatory bodies. Ultimately, Garcia's frustration is understandable. Conte's presence in boxing, especially in high-profile fights like Haney versus Garcia, is deeply troubling. His history of doping and manipulation should disqualify him from any involvement in the sport. Yet here he is, working with some of boxing's biggest names and promoting his supplements with impunity. The fact remains that Conte's influence in boxing is a symptom of a larger issue: the sport's leniency toward doping and the individuals who enable it. Until stricter regulations and penalties are enforced, figures like Conte will continue to find a place in the sport, raising questions about the integrity and fairness of boxing at the highest levels. Ryan Garcia has found himself at the center of controversy, and it's worth dissecting the situation to understand the nuances. While Garcia has plenty of fans backing his claims of innocence, many of them are being swayed by his social media proclamations. He's told his millions of followers that only a billionth of a gram of ostarine was found in his system. However, this assertion doesn't hold up under scrutiny, as the actual levels detected were 60 times the permitted testing limit. Both his A and B samples returned the same results, confirming the presence of ostarine. Adding to the skepticism, the manufacturer of the supplement Garcia blamed for contamination issued a statement saying their product has never contained ostarine. This should have put an end to any debate. Yet Garcia hasn't faced an immediate ban, and the delay raises questions. Why hasn't action been taken? Even if his claim about trace amounts were true, such residues could indicate prior heavy use, masked by dilution or degradation over time. Anti-doping protocols consider strict liability, meaning an athlete is responsible for what's in their body regardless of intent. So why hasn't this principle been applied swiftly here? Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Doping in sports is nothing new, and as Nate Diaz famously said, everybody's on steroids. But how do athletes get away with it? Anti-doping agencies like WADA and WADA test for substances known to enhance performance. They analyze blood or urine samples, searching for chemical structures that match banned substances. However, this system has a significant limitation. Agencies can only detect compounds they already know about. If a banned substance is modified to alter its structure, it can evade detection entirely. This creates a cat-and-mouse game between dopers and regulators. One common technique to evade detection is microdosing. Athletes take minuscule amounts of banned substances, such as EPO, to ensure their bodies process the drug before testing. For example, an athlete could take a tiny dose of EPO before bed and drink a large amount of water. By morning, the substance may have broken down or been diluted to undetectable levels. This is just one of countless ways athletes exploit loopholes in the system, and experts like Victor Conte, with his vast knowledge of doping protocols, are well-versed in these tactics. Victor Conte's name continues to loom large in boxing. Once infamous for creating undetectable performance-enhancing drugs and coaching athletes on how to use them without getting caught, Conte now works with some of the sport's top fighters. Despite serving time for his role in the Balco scandal, he's back in the game, promoting his supplement brand, Snack, and advising athletes like Devin Haney and Terrence Crawford. Critics argue that someone with his history should be nowhere near professional sports, yet his presence is tolerated, if not accepted. This brings us back to Garcia. He may receive a minor slap on the wrist, such as a 6-month ban, a suspension, that conveniently aligns with the typical time between his fights. If this happens, he'll likely return to the ring unscathed, claiming victimhood and blaming a broken system. Meanwhile, others have faced harsher penalties for lesser infractions. Take Adam Machaj, a British heavyweight, who received a 4-year ban in 2019 for using clomiphene, a testosterone booster. By contrast, Jarrell Big Baby Miller failed tests for 3 banned substances, including EPO administered via injection, and was handed a mere 6-month suspension. The disparity in punishments is baffling and underscores the lack of consistency in boxing's approach to doping. The ultimate issue is the absence of a unified governing body in boxing. Unlike other sports with centralized regulatory systems, boxing's fragmented structure leaves oversight to various commissions and organizations, each with its own rules and standards. This patchwork approach results in uneven enforcement and punishments, allowing high-profile fighters to receive preferential treatment while others face the full brunt of the law. So where does this leave us? The lack of balance and consistency in anti-doping measures undermines the sport's integrity. Fighters like Garcia benefit from this broken system, while others are made examples of for far less. Until boxing establishes a centralized authority to oversee and enforce anti-doping regulations, the problems will persist. For now, fans and athletes alike are left questioning the fairness of a sport that seems more concerned with protecting its biggest stars than upholding its standards.